Thank you for joining our webinar, Agile Research in Action. I'm your host, Monica Gilson, the Marketing and Events Manager for M3 Global Research. I am joined today by Tim Dungy, a Client Service Director out of our M3 Global Research London office. Tim has 15 years of experience in healthcare market research. He started his career at Martin Hamblin and has held roles at GfK, Metafield, Instar Research, and Sermo. He has both a strong operational background and a full service experience, having managed operational and research teams. Tim is dedicated to end-to-end client service, providing support and solutions throughout the entire project lifecycle. Tim will be taking questions at the end. You can submit them anytime during the webinar by using the Q&A function. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat function. Both of these options are available in the webinar console. Tim, take it away.
Thank you very much, Monica. So this is an area that I am particularly excited about presenting because I first started getting involved in Agile research about 5 or 6 years ago, and having worked with clients on both agency and pharma side, I've seen how conversations about Agile have changed, how attitudes towards Agile research have changed, and how the concept itself has evolved in this time. Now, Agile research is not a new idea. It's been around for some time, and yet it is still a term which causes some confusion. In fact, if you look up any articles or discussions about Agile, you'll find there's plenty of conversation and plenty of interest out there. But there's also a lack of agreement about what Agile actually is. And it's a little bit like digital a few years ago, which became a buzzword in the industry, and a lot of people within the industry asking one another, what can we do in digital? What are our digital capabilities? Lots of interest in digital without really having a clear picture of what digital actually was. So in this webinar, I'm going to try and give you a flavor of our interpretation of Agile and the factors we suggest considering when applying Agile principles to healthcare projects. So to try and explain the Agile concept, we're going to go back to a pivotal moment in the evolution of Agile, which took place in 2001. In a ski resort in the mountains of Utah, which was attended by representatives from a number of different software development companies. And they had met to talk about the new era that their businesses were facing, an era of online, of e-business, e-commerce, a new economy, and how they were going to adapt in order to embrace this new era. And the results of these discussions was a collective pledge for a new way of working. And this is how the Agile Manifesto was born. And it is summarized by these 4 key principles. So instead of thinking about processes and tools, we want to think about individuals and interactions. Instead of having comprehensive documentation, we want to have working software. Instead of spending time negotiating contracts, we want to spend our time collaborating with our customers. And instead of following a strict plan, we want to be able to respond to change. Now this Agile concept quickly moved into many other areas, one of which of course was market research. And this coincided very well with changes in technology. Now, these changes in technology are, of course, they're not exclusive to Agile research, but they do complement very well Agile approaches because you are able to leverage technology to get data more quickly. With the existence of DIY survey platforms and online panels for rapid sample access, But they also allow you to get from data to insights much more quickly with the use of things like live dashboards, transcription tools, natural language processing, and so on. And these changes coincided very well with the change in mindset that accompanies Agile research, which is really all about moving away from having fixed research objectives and towards adapting objectives as the project progresses. It's about removing the superfluous data and keeping a very tight focus on the key business questions. It's about having bite-sized insights that can easily be shared and understood by a number of different stakeholders. And it's about having this term here, minimal viable feedback. So some of you might be familiar with the term minimal viable product, which is the idea that you create the most basic form of a service or a platform or a product, and you allow the interactions that your customers have with that product to dictate how you're going to develop it further. And there is a parallel of this within research in which you obtain the most fundamental insights and you allow the implications of those insights and the reaction to those insights to dictate the further direction of the research. Now, broadly speaking, not specific to healthcare, there are a number of different applications as a result of this, such as getting a quick overview of the current state of the market, a quick consumer read. And this might be done in isolation, or it might be done in conjunction with ongoing promotional campaigns to get reactions from your customers to those campaigns, or it might be to gauge reaction to events that are happening in the marketplace itself. Another approach is to gather feedback on products and services as they are being developed and allowing those insights to influence development. So to create a kind of feedback loop between the research and development. And similarly, you could take a kind of organic approach to developing brand names or key messages. As I said, here we're talking about market research in general, but we're now going to look at a healthcare specific example and show you a case study that we did with the research partnership. And this case study involved two components. So the first component was a traditional demand assessment study for a client's new asset. And we ran this alongside an Agile pulse survey. And the reason we did this was because, as with so much research, the need to feed data into forecasting was very urgent, and we felt this was a really good opportunity to assess the benefits of a rapid turnaround approach, and also to see how it might be used in similar situations. So our case study involves these two arms, the traditional demand assessment, or the main phase, which was a 30-minute survey in the EU5 with 60 physicians per market. And alongside that, we had our Agile phase, which was a much shorter survey. It was done in the UK only with 40 physicians per market. So let's look at some of the results from this. So first of all, looking at factors influencing prescribing. So in this exercise, we asked our respondents to allocate 100 points across 8 attributes to indicate their influence on prescribing in this category. And as you can see, there are obviously some differences between the main phase and the Agile phase, but there is a remarkably similar pattern across both of the pieces of research, with efficacy 2 at the top there being the standout driver to influence prescribing. If we now look at some top-line results, so firstly, we're looking at the likelihood use two of the products that we tested. So if you take the main phase across product X and Y in isolation, and you do the same for the Agile phase, take it in isolation, you can see that across product X and Y, they're in the same ballpark as each other. But then if you compare both phases of research against each other, you can see that there's some clear differences there. And we suspect that this might be because in the main phase, there were a lot more questions about each of these products. So perhaps there was a lot more context, a lot more time for the physicians to consider their answers, which might have produced this discrepancy. If we then look at market share, so here you can clearly see that there are some very strong similarities across both the main phase and the Agile phase across both products, particularly for product Y, which was in fact the client's product that we were testing. And definitely the results here are close enough to feed into a forecasting model, which was the intention here. So let's look at what we got out of the main phase of the research. So the main phase was designed to address a number of different research objectives, including prescribing and uptake by line of therapy and disease state, looking at unmet needs, awareness of new products, reactions to the product profiles. In fact, we were able to test a third competitor product in the main phase of the research, looking at the impact of alternative endpoints and so on. Whereas in the Agile phase, obviously it addressed fewer of these objectives, but it still did address some of the things we were hoping to achieve, and definitely enough to give us the minimally viable feedback that we needed to feed into some initial calculations. In terms of timelines, so as you would expect, there is a clear advantage to the Agile offering, which is obviously very beneficial if you're in a situation where the team you're working with needs data to develop or update forecasts, and they need it as a matter of urgency. However, we have to look, of course, in terms of the overall project length, not just the execution at this stage, which brings us to one of the key challenges that we face in healthcare, which is the time needed to approve the research, the time needed to approve the materials for the research, which, as we all know, it can be a matter of weeks and in some cases a matter of months. And when you're dealing with those kind of timelines, shortening the fieldwork time kind of dwarfs in comparison to the time it's taken to get you to that point where you can actually launch the fieldwork in the first place. However, this isn't the end of the story. There are some things that you can consider. So, for example, having a standard set of questions that are pre-approved for the research, which is something might be very useful if you're thinking about doing something like a long-term online community, having those questions approved up front so that they can be deployed as necessary throughout the research program. Similarly, you might want to think about having a pre-approved survey structure. So perhaps something like, a reputation assessment type study that can be used across a number of different brands, a number of different therapy areas, and having the structure of those questions approved up front so that they can be adapted to different brands and different therapy areas as and when they're needed. Another thing to consider, and this went into more detail in our previous Agile webinar that we did a few weeks ago, and if anyone does want to look at that, please do contact us. But we talked about one option is actually getting involved with your PV or the compliance team right at the very start, getting them to understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and trying to anticipate and address some of the hurdles early on. Now that of course doesn't work for every company, but it is something to consider if you can take that approach. Other considerations. So even though Agile tends to be very, very fast, and that is one of the key advantages of it, it still requires very careful planning. And the reason why it requires careful planning is because you're trying to get the most amount of insights from the fewest number of questions. So it really does take some careful thought about how you're going to address the business objective that you have at hand with the least number of questions. Similarly, you need to think about the fact that you're going to have less context in which to understand the data because you're asking fewer questions. So you need to think about how you can leverage perhaps previous research that has been done to provide you with that context, and also think about how well you know that particular therapy area, and if you've got a good sound understanding of that therapy area in which to understand the results that are coming back. And the danger of having less context and not having careful planning is that you can end up making more work for yourself in the long run, because each time you're pulsing a survey, you're not getting the answers that you need, and you're having to go back and back and back again. So it really does require careful planning. And finally, on self-service models for conducting Agile research. So self-service models, they obviously allow for a lot of flexibility, a lot of convenience in conducting Agile research, but they also put a lot of responsibility on one person's shoulders. And with shrinking budgets and shrinking teams, that's not always a welcome prospect and is not always the best solution for everyone. In terms of how this can now be applied in general within healthcare, so we've given some examples here. I guess one of the key applications is for whenever data or insights is needed quickly. So for example, if you're putting together a pitch or proposal, or even planning a piece of research, generally you don't have a lot of time to do that. But having some kind of data or having some kind of insights from the physicians that you're ultimately going to be targeting, or the stakeholders that you're ultimately going to be targeting, could really help to strengthen your pitch and differentiate it. And that's where Agile can really come into play. It can also be used as part of ongoing research projects, as we've seen, to get an early forecast into what the data is telling us. It can also be used in reaction to results from research. So perhaps something interesting comes up as a result of the research, and you want to explore that further to really understand it properly. Or even perhaps you're in the middle of doing a series of central locations, and one of the physicians you're interviewing throws up something that has never been considered before. With Agile, you're able to go out and get data from a wide population of physicians to really understand some of those insights better. But it can also be used to understand things that are happening outside of the research, to gauge reaction of physicians to events within the marketplace. So things like approvals or withdrawals of competitor products. Similarly, if you're looking at perhaps early assets or BD evaluations, and generally decisions have to be made within a very, very short period of time, again, Agile is a great tool to use in those circumstances. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also use it in a more iterative approach, perhaps to develop key messages or product profiles, a kind of trial and error approach to developing some of those kind of materials. So, in conclusion, the subject of Agile, we find, is coming up more and more in conversations. And we often hear people telling us that they've heard one of the other brand teams or another office within their organization has run a fantastic piece of Agile research that's had a really positive impact, and they want to know how they can do the same. When running an Agile project, it is important to think about some of the considerations I mentioned, but it's also really important to think how and where you're going to use the research. So Agile, it's not a panacea to solve all of your research problems, but in specific areas, it can be a very, very powerful tool. And it's certainly a tool that more and more of us in the industry want to have at our disposal. And with that, we're going to take a few minutes for any questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. As Tim said, if you have any questions, we welcome you to submit them now using the Q&A function. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I wanted to let you know that you'll be directed to a 7-question survey following the webinar, where we greatly appreciate your feedback. Also, this is our final webinar of the year, but invite you to view all of our past webinars found on the resources page of our website at m3globalresearch.com. We have our first question. How can you be sure that you are getting reliable data from an Agile approach?
Thank you, Monica. Actually, that question comes up a lot because, you know, understandably, as we've said, with an Agile piece of research, you're getting less context to understand the data, and with that, there's less reliability concerns as well. I guess the thing about Agile, as I've said, it's not something that can be used in every single situation. So you've really got to think about your research objectives and what you're trying to achieve. And I think the key message about this is you need to have the right tool for the right job. So Agile isn't going to be the right tool for every single situation if you're, you know, running large segmentation studies that require robust data within specific segments, for example. Agile probably isn't the right research, but if you want to get some data to help feed into that segmentation study to really help define your segments, perhaps, you know, Agile might be a good usage there.
A new question we had is, are you defining Agile research as essentially quick turnaround research with those stated considerations, or is there something else that defines it?
Yeah, again, that's often a good a question that comes up a lot. And Agile, it isn't just about doing things quickly, although the speed at which you do things obviously is normally an advantage of doing Agile research, because it does apply to situations where where you need insights very, very quickly. But it isn't just about the speed. It's also about being able to respond to things that are happening, which isn't always a matter of speed. So, questions come up at internal meetings throw up questions, or feedback from the sales team throws up questions that you haven't thought about. And Agile is really about being able to have that nimble approach to be able to find answers to those questions. It's also about taking an iterative approach, as I mentioned earlier, which again, it's not always about speed. Being able to kind of test an idea and see the results from those tests and learn from it, and perhaps do another test to kind of refine your understanding of those insights.
Great. In the case study, how did you accommodate for comparisons between markets? Was the UK included in the main phase?
Yeah, the UK was definitely included in the main phase, and that was obviously taken into consideration when we were making the comparisons between markets. One thing I didn't mention earlier was that the sample sizes, as some of you might have noticed, were different because we were trying to go to the same types of physicians at the same time, and obviously we wanted to have separate groups. We didn't want any kind of overlap between the groups, and that was the maximum sample that could be achieved in that kind of time frame. But actually, that's fairly typical of an Agile piece of research, those kind of sample sizes that we looked at.
Tim, you may have addressed this in your previous question, but our last question currently is, if Agile approach is to be only about a shorter questionnaire, or is it also about a different approach in Recruit or something else?
Sure. I mean, it's the questions tend to be shorter. So if it's if you're taking a quantitative Agile approach, it tends to be somewhere between 5 and 10 questions that are the really key questions you're trying to ask. If you're taking a more qualitative Agile approach, it tends to be a kind of 15-20 minute discussion rather than a 45-60 minute discussion. But you also need to think about, again, your research objectives and who you're trying to target. So, if there is a very, very specific target group, for example, and that you need a lot of screening questions to really hone in on that specific target group, that doesn't necessarily lend itself well to Agile. It can, of course, be done, but it's not necessarily something you might want to consider for an Agile approach. So you might want to think about about your target audience and about what you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you all for your questions. If we didn't get to your question today, or if you have additional questions, please reach out to us at marketing@usa.m3.com. We're happy to help you or connect you with someone else who can help answer your question. You can expect to receive an email with a recording of today's webinar later this week. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Tim. We look forward to hearing from you, and enjoy the rest of your day.